Amrita,
Bhakti.
what happens when caste enters mainstream media?
I don't know. I guess it means more interesting roles for upper caste actors.
Gosh, you're right. Cynical, but that is correct, Amrita. And I guess it's not funny because it's almost true at this point. And I think one of the things we're trying to tackle today, we're thinking about the representation of caste in mainstream media, TV shows, Bollywood, all kinds of books coming out and so on. And it seems like we're at a really interesting moment in India where there is a sudden visibility, I would like to say, wokeness about caste politics, discriminatory practices that have become the center of attention and are now widely accepted as stories to be told for TV and film, right?
Yeah.
And I think the last decade seems to be particularly productive. Would you agree there's a shift at the moment?
You know, sadly, I think you're right because it seems that we have suddenly woken up from thousands of years that we were not paying attention. And the last decade, I'm thinking of all these films, Sairat, Fandry, Article 15, which I saw recently,
Hmm.
um, and a host of other South Indian films. Of course, I just came out of watching the series Dahaad, which I liked very much, but we can talk about that later. And then the whole controversy and the episode in Made in Heaven, part
Right.
two, right? And I mean, they show a certain kind of the problem of casteism and the discriminatory practices. But I want to know, Bhakti, what you think of all this change. I mean, I feel that there is a shift, which is a
Yeah.
good thing, but what does this visibility mean?
Yeah, exactly. And before I forget, I would like to tell our listeners that we are going to have an incredible guest today who's been dealing with a lot of trolling and controversy. We are going to welcome Yashica Dutt. And this is the person on whom an episode in the TV series Made in Heaven was based, and they didn't credit her. And it turned into this massive controversy, and instead of just saying thank you, we loved reading your book and building this character after you, they sort of doubled down and decided to kind of put her out and cast her out and then insist that it's not her story, and then she's being trolled heavily. And here there's an intersection, of course, of caste and gender, so there's a lot of misogyny she's been experiencing, and she's going to tell us, really, she's the one with the answer, like what happens when caste enters mainstream representational kind of politics, right? I think, yes, there is a shift. You're right. You named a lot of interesting movies and series and so on. But the truth is, what does visibility mean? When we think about questions of representation, sometimes there is also this idea that it's a kind of death by inclusion, because you dilute the politics of the culture so intensely, or you exploit it so thoroughly that you lose the granular ability to really understand a certain community or a certain a certain kind of population in an illuminated light. So yes, we want the visibility, of course. Why would we want invisibility? Sure, you want things to be visible, but when these things become trendy, I think we have to bear in mind that we end up messing them up. And I guess what we should talk about is what are some of the messy ways in this in messy things that are happening. Yashika's story is unique, it's interesting, but I expect many people are feeling that their stories are being appropriated.
I
Is
think,
the caste being represented well? Is caste politics being represented well?
right. And I think that, you raise some really important points here. First of all, is it just about thanking her and giving a credit? I mean, I think people should also realize that, it's histories of erasures. So it's not just putting a credit line out there, right? There's
Right.
something else behind that, asking for a certain kind of acknowledgement at play
Mhm.
here. And then you're talking about visibility and representation, which is so true. And I can't wait to hear from Yashica about the story, about what happened. But also, we need to pause and, I guess, reflect about what's going wrong when you say death by inclusion. I mean, suddenly all of these really sort of pushing the boundary films, right? People might think that, hey, some work is being done, so why negate that? And
Yeah.
I think what you're asking is, what happens to that kind of representation? Is it then sort of doubly doing a certain kind of victimization of
Yeah.
um, you know, quote unquote lower caste people or Dalit people? And, let's start with maybe this film that really, for me, was a tremendous game changer, Sairat. I think it came out in
Mhm.
2014, Marathi film by a
Yes.
Dalit filmmaker, Nagraj Manjule. And, I was horrified. I couldn't sleep for days. I think it's a horrific film.
Yeah.
It's a great film, but then, there's it backfired in the kind of criticism online, in the online space.
Yeah.
Do you know about what happened with this film, Bhakti?
No.
So, I felt that, the kinds of criticisms were that it was a cautionary tale
Oh
being
God.
told, saying that, do you see what happened to the characters? And there's this upper caste woman, Archie, and then there's this lower caste boy,
Mm.
fall in love, and they elope and they get married. And then there's an honor killing by her upper caste family,
Ooh.
including the child. It's a horrific film, and really a reminder of what is around us. But what, the online trolling happened in a way which said that, oh, don't ever go in for intercaste marriage. See, we should be keeping
Right.
the boundaries intact.
Yeah, yeah. See,
It
like
should,
the skewed messaging where it's like, oh, maybe not kill somebody for
yeah.
that. Instead, it's like, oh, just don't go there. Yeah, it's
Also,
disgusting.
sadly enough, there was a lot of, kind of bad digging about the filmmaker's history, his personal
Okay,
life, excavating,
of course.
putting it on online, that what kind of a human being he is. And, a really sad and tragic ending to an important film. So the after effect of something is also tremendously problematic,
Yeah, no,
right?
no, I hear you. I hear you. One of the issues that I had sensed or I've been observing, and I think it's maybe the practice is less now. I don't know, but like one of the things you see is like representation of certain castes and class conjoined. Often they will use brown face, they will darken the skin because you just automatically assume this narrative around certain colors for certain caste or certain class. And this is a very widespread practice,
Yeah.
of course, in Bollywood. So that's one kind of ridiculous thing. The thing that worries me also is like a kind of pornography of violence. Like I thought Article 15 took on very bold themes and so on, but I think like the depiction of violence, it's sort of like I think was so extreme and so intense and so gory that it didn't dignify those people with it didn't dignify the story. There's a way to do this that is done right. I have to say though, and I think we have talked about this before, but we should kind of rehash it again. I like Dahaad, which was also done, by the way, by Tiger Bay Films, which is
Yeah.
Zoya Akhtar and Rima Kakti, who are now the offenders in the Yashica Dutt story.
Yeah.
But I like Dahaad. What did you think?
Well, I just go back to something very important you said about Article 15. I recently watched it, and I felt exactly what you're talking about in terms of the representation of the Dalit people. What we have is this kind of, important actor, Saini Gupta, I think, is one of the Dalit woman characters, and she's brown faced in the film significantly. And then the portrayal of the people the Dalit people are in a really deplorable light. They are victims. They're constantly, very skinny. There is no empowerment, and the only empowered character is this upper caste Brahmin who is the savior of the entire situation and the context in the investigation and brings change. So really, are we shifting any kinds of stereotypical depiction here?
Yeah, absolutely. And you cannot have stories of discrimination and marginalization and abject levels of violence unless the story turns and shows also empowerment. And I understand that we're very far in India in the lived experience of it to think about the normal lives of people, of certain families and so on. And I know there is so much poverty, there is so much intensity and scarcity and precarity, and I get it. But there is also spaces of joy, there's also spaces of normalcy. They also enjoy their birthdays, or you know what I mean. So when you just focus on like the ripped apart violated body, you're doing a lot of harm also to the representation. That said, though, it's interesting because the protagonist of Dahaad, Anjali Bhatti, is the name of this cop. And she's like this extra cool cop played by Sonakshi Sinha. We don't want to touch upon the fact that this is like a nepo baby or whatever.
Yeah. Hey, I liked Dahaad, Bhakti. I did like it.
I liked it too. But I think one of the critiques was like, who is this? Is she really from a certain caste community? Because she's like riding around a motorbike, she goes for jogs at night. None of this is plausible. So we're not willing, critics even are not willing to accept that there is an empowered type like that.
Right. That's the point. I actually do agree with that. I mean, here is when we do see a shift in representation of a Dalit woman. And then there are critiques about how is this fitting the narrative? Why is she jogging and riding a bike? Oh, that's the point being made, right? There is this gaze that we need to shift and change our optics within and without, right? So, but, let's not throw away the baby out with the bathwater. Let's stick to... And it's sad though our bars are so low that now I do feel that Dahaad is slightly different from Article 15 and what's out there, because it is of course showing the horrific nature of prejudice and discrimination of caste, but also intersectionally with misogyny and patriarchy and what happens then to that. But the critique is also that all of these women's stories who actually died because of casteism and misogyny, their stories are lost, and what we have is this real focus on the villain, the figure, the murderer. Would you agree with that? Is that kind of erasing the women's stories in the series?
No, I don't think so. I mean, yes, he's a very alluring actor. I think the plot is very enticing and interesting, and he did a great job. But I think you have the counterpoint. You have the counterpoint in the woman character who realizes, who makes the link. And every time she enters the Thana, the police station, there is another cop who burns incense because, because of her caste. I mean, these little touches, I thought they were so shocking to me. Of course, people do these horrible stuff, and I think they managed to get at it. And I think, yes, that actor is alluring. Of course, we follow him with our, heart in our throat. But I think she remains a good counterpoint.
And I agree. I mean, there are these small subversive spaces in that series where, even when at the end, and I don't want to give it out completely, but the claiming of the Dalit identity, where she has constantly not
changed her name, right?
Yes, exactly. She claims it. And, and one is a constant reminder that even with a power position like, authoritative cop force in this little town, she would not be allowed to enter spaces to investigate because a certain, space is considered pure or upper caste. And those are really important ways of showcasing from the perspective of this woman how caste really unraveled around us, right? And the horrific nature of it.
Yeah. I mean, look, Yashica is about to come in a few minutes. But before that, can we quickly say that that Made in Heaven episode was very moving. I mean, I had two reactions. One, it's like, oh, this is based on Yashica's book. I know it. How cool. And then the
Yeah,
second reaction was like, wow, this is really beautiful. Like the wedding, I'm
I
not
loved
like a
it.
wedding person. Like that was just so absolutely gorgeous, wasn't it?
It was a great episode, Bhakti. I mean, what happened as an after effect, we will obviously talk about it with Yashika, but it is a good episode. It is the kind of representation that I would like to see. And
Yeah.
yet, is it enough? That's a
Yeah.
larger question that we have to pose to ourselves today, right?
Yeah, and you know what? Before, to be fair to Yashika, she also said she loved the episode. It was made by a Dalit director, and then it all sort of went sour. And I see her now in the studio, so we'll ask her more details about it. Hi, Yashika. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Extra Salty. I know how busy you've been, how terrible the last few weeks have been, and thank you so much for making the time. Really, we are so grateful and so honored, actually.
No, thank you so much, Bhakti and Amrita.
Welcome, Yashika.
Thank you. I'm really honored to be here because, as you said, last few days, last few weeks have
Yeah.
felt like a battleground. So to be
Mhm.
in this kind of space where I don't have to just explain myself over and over again, but we can
Yeah.
talk about the larger cause of these issues is very freeing.
Absolutely.
So thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, what happened is that the way in which the controversy with the Made in Heaven episode unraveled, it really pushed anybody thinking about media and Bollywood and representation and TV, is first of all the way in which all these shows and films and even books and stuff like that have really exploded in the last decade or so. Amrita and I were just talking about films like Sairat, Article 15, lots
Sure.
of like South Indian films, and then a show that we loved, but you can tell us whether we should hate it, and we will, was Dahaad. And then, of course, there's Made in Heaven. And I think a very interesting focus, of course, on gender, which is much appreciated, whatever the problems there might be. And then, of course, we've seen the new Ava DuVernay films are out in Hollywood. The film called Origins, based on Isabel Wilkerson's book Caste, and I know it has Ambedkar in it. It has writers like Suraj Jangde in it. So there's lots going on, and I just wanted to start with what do you think has prompted this shift or this change in the recent years?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I want to start by saying I don't think I'm in a position to recommend what people should watch or shouldn't watch. I think, I think we should be able to parse. We should have that understanding of culture. My hope is that we create this broader understanding of culture where every audience member, at least folks who are, subscribing to these streaming services, will be able to parse for themselves. They will be able to make their own decisions because they can see what's happening on their screen, whether that's working towards the right cause of representation or not. So I just want to start by saying that. And I think you rightly pointed out, last couple of years we've seen this, some could call it a really welcome explosion of Dalit representation, Dalit oriented stories, storytelling, media around our culture, which really was not seen before. And I think the way I understand that, and Sairat is probably one exception, but all these movies happened more or less after 2016. And, 2016, as we know, is the year that Rohit Vemula was institutionally murdered, where he was forced
Yeah.
to commit suicide and take his own life
Oh,
because of, the casteism that he was experiencing at his university.
Right.
And that became such a turning point for Dalit narratives. It forced us to take a look, somehow at everything that we were um, doing in terms of or not doing in terms of Dalit representation and Dalit stories. We took a massive look at journalism, and that, especially in journalism, this wasn't the first time that that issue had been talked about. It had been talked about 2007, 2010, 2012. We were talking about where are the Dalit journalists,
Right.
and I think with Rohit's story that really was brought into focus, who are the people who are covering this story? There were massive protests, student led protests that broke out in Hyderabad, where people were demanding that his death be recognized rightfully as the institutional murder that is. Or,
Mhm.
when we saw his Dalitness being brought into question, people said he's not Dalit enough because he had, one parent who was probably OBC, and they wasn't sure if that was the case, or but his mother who raised him was a Dalit woman, and that's so all these questions that were so the cruelty that we have seen, I think, in the past 5 weeks is very the similar level of cruelty that we experienced back then when we saw a culture attacking somebody, and of course the stakes are so much higher.
Mm.
That is so much more significant moment in terms of how it forces us to take a relook at our culture,
Mhm.
and it did. I think, in my opinion, it gave rise to this new Dalit narrative that we are seeing right now, whether it was in
Yeah.
music, in arts, in journalism, and I think one of the reasons my story captivated a lot of people was
Mhm.
because I was a Dalit journalist, and people just had not heard of
Right.
a Dalit journalist openly expressing their identity until that time. I'm
Mm.
very thankful to say that there are so many now. But if you remember, there was a piece by Sudipta Mondal that came right after, I think, in 2015, and he like counted a couple of people, and there weren't more than 5, 7 of us. And that's a
Mhm.
shocking number in a country as large as India. And I think that moment allowed us to say, where is representation in cinema? And of course, there were Marathi language films that were
Yeah.
already focusing on caste, because Bhakti, as you know, there is so much assertion for caste in
Yeah.
Maharashtra. So
Yeah.
it wasn't surprising that that assertion came from there, or from the South, for example. I
Yeah.
think Bollywood or Hindi film industry and television has been so late to catch up to what was already going on, and
That's
now
it.
we are beginning to see, after many years. They
Mm.
had this attempt with the Mayawati movie, which was not which was again criticized, rightfully so, for not depicting the character with the depth and sensitivity that they should have. Or lately we've had the Har, for example, which is again, if you look at it, it's by the same makers of Made in Heaven.
Yeah.
So and
Right.
I'll be completely honest with you, it was on my watch list, but after the violence that has ensued from their end,
Yeah.
I don't think I
Oh
can make
gosh.
myself watch that anytime
No, you
soon.
shouldn't. You shouldn't.
But everything that I've heard about it, in terms of the portrayal of the characters, seems remarkable. Like a
Right.
strong, assertive Dalit woman in the
Yeah.
police, which is,
Absolutely.
which is frankly a version that so many of us had. Like, at least as far as my family is concerned, they wanted me to become like Kiran Bedi.
Wow.
There
Oh,
was
okay.
the whole thing was that you joined the IAS because for decades and decades, the only way available to Dalit families who wanted upward mobility, who wanted to break from the caste professions,
Mm.
was to join the IAS, right?
Right.
So I empathize with that story.
Yeah.
And I also want to say that, for me, coming from a Bhangi family, coming from a manual scavenging caste, IS was probably the only option available. So that's a very relatable
Mm.
story. But at the same time, the reason for that explosion, I want to say, this welcome explosion, is Dalit people.
Yeah.
Is the anti-caste space. No matter, despite of how brutal that space has been personally for me over the past 5 weeks, I still want to say that it's the voice of the people that made
Yeah.
an industry like Bollywood consider our stories.
Right.
It's
Mhm.
folks like, whether it's Paranjeet or whether it's Neeraj Kevin, who with so much difficulty made that space for themselves,
Mm.
and made those stories profitable. Gavin made Masan and Article 15, I'm guessing,
Right.
before he expressed his Dalit identity openly. And I could be wrong with the timeline, but I know Masan was made before he
Yeah.
admitted to the fact that he was Dalit. So
Right.
I think people have been inside and making these changes from the inside. Dalits have been a part of the Hindi film industry in particular for a very long time.
Mm.
And now they can assert themselves thanks to the culture that has changed outside of Hindi films, if
Hmm.
that makes
Yashika,
sense.
I wanted to quickly talk about, I mean, you mentioned this culture of explosion and Indian cinema and the entertainment industry. And thankfully, some bits of changes are happening. But the majority of people from upper caste backgrounds, or let's say nepotist privilege, are creating this kinds of visibilities possible and producing all the thinking about caste that we're seeing around us, right? And they have this huge voice and power that you mentioned, that it's dominated by Bollywood thinking and what viewers should think about caste, or what is the representation of a Dalit person, whether it's a gendered person or not, a woman or not. And what are the inevitable pitfalls, though? I mean, you mentioned some of them,
Yeah.
but what are the pitfalls in creating these kinds of
Yeah.
visibilities?
Yeah. When upper caste folks have the voice to generate that.
Right. And we're coming out of a chat, Bhakti and I, where we were talking about, a certain kind of victimization that gets stereotyped again and again.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think that's a really important question to ask. Who's really pulling these strings? Who's really green lighting these projects, right? Like over here in just in, coming back to this case that with Made in Heaven, they thought they did everything right, and they did, right? They hired a Dalit director. They gave him the free reign at least to direct one episode, or two episodes that Kevin has directed, and really portray the character in the way that he finds sensible and sensitive. I think those were the things they got right. But when it came to actual representation, when it came to actually crediting the person whose story that they had so blatantly taken, and it's like, I want to say again, it's not just my story. I'm not married, so of course that's not, the character's choices are not mine. I'm sure that many of them are Gavin's himself. But at the same time, the infrastructure of that character is very much points back to me. And when
Yeah.
it came to giving that credit, they behaved in the same violent way that Bollywood has always behaved with people who have asked for the rightful credit. So they went back to their I would say those roots of violence and denial. And, the ideas that anybody's stories is there for them to take because they're doing us a favor by depicting us on screen. Just, I know you asked about what are the pitfalls of upper caste or dominant caste people wading into these Dalit waters. I think we cannot ignore what's going on currently. Or, even with the Mayawati movie, for example, it was created by dominant caste, acted by dominant caste people, directed by them. And when they were criticized, their response was, fine, when we won't do these kind of stories anymore. So,
Right.
even with this whole 5 weeks ordeal, I've heard it again and again with many dominant caste commenters who are just eating popcorn on the side say, oh, her demand is just going to make more people more reluctant in taking these type of stories.
Yeah.
Well, you're not doing us a favor
Yeah.
Exactly.
by taking our stories. You're doing it for your own profit. You didn't do it 20 years ago. Until 20 years ago, Kachra was a character in Lagan who was literally named after garbage because that was profitable for you. For
You're right.
you, the bottom line is profit. The bottom line is not representation. The bottom line is how to appeal to a global,
Yeah.
wider audience, how to
Tell
appeal
new
to like
stories in a way.
right, and also how to appeal to global award shows. Like, if no
Yeah.
one's foolish, everyone's seen how global, especially in the US, how diversity is being hammered so importantly, and it is important, right? Like,
Yeah.
whether it's East Asian representation in general, or obviously Black representation in cinema, that's changed since the Obama years in a very significant way. So
Right.
that's now catching up in India. But like, I feel like a lot of people, they want the stories, but they don't want the person. Like I've said it before, they don't want to really look into.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, I was just gonna say that, like, I watched the episode before the controversy, and I know your book, I know you as a public figure, and I was like, oh, they're doing Yashica's book, how exciting, how fun. It was immediate, and I know many WhatsApps went around saying
Yeah.
that, you know and then the whole thing just exploded, and it was so shocking, and I was literally absolutely baffled. But I want to ask you, and only if you want to share, like what is the timeline? Because I felt like there was a moment when the director did acknowledge that
That
it
it was
was
you.
it was based on you. Then there was a whole kind of lawyer or legalistic language that they just immediately pushed back against you and wrote all this stuff. And uh, and but and then at the same time, it's like, I think it's never clear. Like, now they're making it seem like you're ungrateful, and what do you want, and do you want, do you even want these stories to be made, all this kind of stuff. There's all these dynamics out there. And I do want to ask you, like, um you know would you have been happy with just a little credit? Like, what is it that has gone horribly wrong for you? You know what I mean? Like, I just want you to share that if possible.
I think what's gone wrong, Bhakti, is that their mask of being progressive has been ripped off. That has gone wrong. It's not me changing my stance. I've been the same
Yeah.
person that they could easily pull this character based off of and say personal is political. Those are not my words, but that's how I've lived my life. So when the person that, at least in part, in their own words, stood up to say, can I please get an acknowledgement in a global way and not just on an Instagram handle with like 40, 50,000 followers that is going to be seen by some people but not by the others. It all, the lid blew off. The lid that was being very tightly preserved and held because they had to project this image of women progressive makers was suddenly, it was, like I said, ripped off. And just to give
Mm,
you a timeline of what happened, I think so the show came out. I've talked about this. Somebody alerted me. A friend of mine said, "Hey, there is a likeness of you," and my reaction was, "That can't be because I'm not married, and I don't know. It's a show about weddings." But when I saw that they're literally taking the first 5 minutes of that storyline from my interviews, this is the
yeah.
Faye D'Souza interview I did in November 2020, since
Wow.
they are all like, we met her later and the episode had been already shot and all these covering up of tracks. November 2020 is when I shot when the Faye D'Souza interview was online, and that is what's been taken from in a very way, the words, etc., talking about grandmother cleaning toilets and coming out as Dalit. So that was, of course, I was very happy to see that. Who wouldn't be? But at the same time, when I realized that this person, they are, they have no intention of linking back to my life that they had so clearly and obviously and blatantly taken from, then it was heartbreaking for me. And I
Mm,
thought that, maybe that'll change. And then Neeraj Kevin acknowledged it in their Instagram post,
yeah.
which was also quite heartening. But at the same time, the conversation then changed. The conversation was like, Neeraj has acknowledged her, so it
Mm,
obviously must be above board. Then it's clear that they took permission. Why else would they acknowledge the author? Something might have happened behind the scenes. And when the conversation pivoted in that way, I was concerned because that was creating a narrative that wasn't true. What were my choices? If whether I could have been like, thanks, Neeraj, but I wish you took permission in a passive aggressive way, or I could have been like, hi, I appreciate the episode. I really like what you've done. Can you please also add the acknowledgement in a formal way? And
Right.
yeah.
that's all I did. That's literally all I did. And I said, Dalit labor has been taken and erased. But I appreciate how you have set a new example. And can we also just recognize the people whose stories have been taken from? That created the most intense hateful reaction from them. If you look at their statement, they then pivoted the narrative from, they're clearly taking from my likeness, to the
Yeah.
origins of the term coming out as Dalit and who it
Yeah.
really belongs to. I'm
Right.
Right.
not just coming out as Dalit, I'm a whole person.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I'm a Dalit journalist who hid my caste for the longest time while being in media, and then talked about my identity in a very open way. I'm somebody who belongs to a very specific subcaste. It's the Bhangi Valmiki caste. Our ancestral profession is to clean toilets. That's why that character could go and sit there and talk about cleaning toilets. The journey that it has taken me. And my book came out in 2019 and I wrote about it. It took me like one full year or more to even say the words Bhangi on screen.
Yeah.
It's a slur. So how can I let that journey that is so uniquely and specifically mine, that is not a coming out is a universal experience for Dalit people. A Bhangi person who's written a book on coming out as Dalit, went to Colombia, talked about her grandmother cleaning toilets, that is not a universal experience. That's my
Absolutely.
experience. And I think when a Dalit woman stood up and said that, that just allowed hell to break loose, because they weren't expecting somebody to so categorically say that is mine, and could
Mm,
you please acknowledge that? Because we don't have a culture, especially in Bollywood, not against women, certainly not Dalit women ever, to stand up and say that's mine, I deserve what I've contributed. And then when I obviously, after that violent response, then Anurag Kashyap, who has no business being a party in any of these conversations, who was forced to apologize for his participation in anti-mandal protests. In fact, headlines were like, Anurag Kashyap has been forced to apologize for his casteist backgrounds, now feels like he has the right to interfere and talk about Dalit representation, and that's allowed to
It's an
happen. How does
extremely
that
bizarre
work?
twist in the tale. I've been following that. I
Right.
don't
And
understand.
he's, no, absolutely. And he's like also echoing their talking points. He's
Mm,
moving it from the theft of my likeness to the origin of the term. So if you see the way this narrative has been twisted and completely messed up,
mm,
that created this 5 weeks of avalanche of hate against me.
mm,
And then of course there were, because when you make the origins of the term the main subject and not the fact that Bollywood took my life without permission, then the whole heat is on me.
yeah.
And the fact that, like we were talking earlier, Anurag Kashyap went to different media houses, gave different interviews unprompted, to call me toxic, to call me opportunistic, to compare me to fascist enablers, to compare me to criminal gangsters. And
Oh.
nobody stood up and said, what the hell are you doing?
wow.
How can you say that against a Dalit woman? There was no uproar. And that was stunning to me,
Mm,
that people didn't hold him accountable because he is supposedly fighting against the fascist government.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah.
because he has that standing in the country, he's allowed to run his mouth against Dalit people, especially Dalit women, unchecked. He's
Yeah.
suddenly the messiah of Dalits. When did that happen? And because he created and enabled this culture that, hey, this Dalit woman, you can call her a toxic person, you can call her an opportunistic person. No one's going to say anything to you. You're not going to be held accountable. What is that signaling? That's
Right.
how hate speech works. We've seen that in the US when Trump's hate speech has this direct effect on trans and LGBTQ people, hate crimes have increased. This is
Absolutely.
hate speech, and
Yeah.
this is the consequence of that. And what Anurag Kashyap did was hate speech and created this avalanche of hate against me that I'm still dealing. And there was this, somebody created this really funny meme on Twitter when, there's this person who's just sitting and smoking while people in this other field are like running around. And the caption was Zoya Akhtar and Anurag Kashyap watching Yashica Dutt being accosted by everyone else, especially the
Oh,
anti-caste community. And it was funny. I mean, I could see the humor in that, and also accurate. Because where is Zoya Akhtar, Rima Kakti, Alankrita Srivastav, and Anurag Kashyap in this conversation? Why is
Right.
this about me getting the hate and not these people? Because
Yeah.
they're the Bollywood establishment. So this is the timeline of how
Mm,
things have happened and how they've muddied the issues, and how even unfortunately many people on Twitter who claim to be anti-caste, claim to be from the anti-caste space, have chosen to defend them instead of defending me. Why that happened is anybody's guess, but the fact is that a Dalit person, a Dalit woman in particular, was left completely on her own to just ask for her own credit,
mm,
mm-hmm.
and was attacked in the most brutal way. There was this idea that, how dare you do that? You're ungrateful. You should be so happy that we even chose to represent you. Like, Bollywood is not in the entire world. I
mm.
live in the US. If
Yeah.
somebody's taking my likeness, they need to damn well credit it. And that's all I
Absolutely.
asked. But their response was, how dare you? Do
How
you
dare
know
you
we are
ask?
Bollywood?
Yeah.
We'll
Yeah.
teach you a lesson.
Right. And I wanted to exactly ask about that nature of attacks and, really cornering you in a space when what does this mean about asking for credit, right? It's not just, there's a history behind it that you talked about it, right? It's centuries of erasures, and it's Dalit labor. And, in the West, you would have to create a certain kind of inspired from message, right? But so it also talks about the larger structural system here.
Mm.
And what would you then like to see in this as a change in structures of erasures of certain kinds of complete silencing of voices and representation of India? What does the entertainment industry slash Bollywood dominant cinema urgently need to do right now?
I think they have to stop posturing. I think they have to stop, you
Oh
know,
gosh.
going after stories because it makes them a quick buck or makes them look good, or
Right.
makes the Emmys say, wow, so progressive,
Get a
much like,
conscience.
yeah,
Yeah.
like, oh, look at this progressive cinema coming from India. And of course, the committee doesn't know what the reality of these shows are. You talked about how in the US this would be a given, and this is a very important point to discuss because let's say if this was being aired on Star Plus or Sony, then it would be a very different set of rules. Then that's the industry standard. Then, of course, one would be like, that's what Bollywood does. It's a global show. I saw it on Amazon Prime US. It's
Mhm.
available across the world to a
Absolutely.
diaspora who's been eagerly waiting for that. They received an Emmy nomination, and rightfully so, for portraying this gay character that has not been portrayed in Indian television, at least Hindi television
Sure.
in film history. And that was pretty radical and remarkable. So when they are competing with, at least let's say US made television and cinema, then how can they, and they're showing themselves on these streaming services, how can they say that we are above the guidelines that are followed by all of them?
Mm.
Yeah.
How can they say that we don't care about the practices that are already in place for many decades now by all these that have been hard fought for? This is like a growing pains moment for Bollywood, where
Mm.
they're like, oh, damn, we can't just, go ahead and take their stories without the permission. We have to do the right thing. We have to do it in a way where we actually credit the people whose stories we are being inspired from.
Yeah.
And I think
Mm.
that change needs to happen when people, it's not going to matter, like me saying this here is not going to change culture in Bollywood, but my hope is that people understand, how the bread is made, really,
Yeah.
like how things come together. And how things come together, at least a lot of people have talked about in the show itself, and the episode is a standout smash hit. I
Yeah,
feel
it's
like it's
beautiful, of
really
course.
Yeah,
beautiful, it's
it's
very
moving.
nicely done. But like other stories within the show, a lot of people have commented that this is not the only story that they seemingly plucked from the headlines, except this time it's my life story. But there are other stories that they've like taken from current lives. And sure, that could be, understood that this is just reflecting culture, but this is someone's life. And I think that's where they
Yeah.
blurred the line. Like, you asked earlier, what is it that Bollywood can do? In a
Right.
couple of interviews, Ms. Zoya Akhtar and Rima Kakti and Ms. Srivastava said, we took a 1 day crash course from Neeraj Ghevan to understand what
Oh
caste
my
is.
God.
And that
Wow.
is the most laughable thing
It's
that anyone can
ridiculous.
ever talk about caste. You are a group who's not made one, but two seemingly anti-caste progressive space shows, and how you did this was on a 1 day crash course.
Not to mention, she's from like a very privileged family. The Akhtar family is like years in this world and wealthy.
They've been around for years. They're Bollywood royalty, some would say, in many
Absolutely.
ways, right? And they've this is not, I'm not trying to make this a conversation on a long line of like the work, etc., but just to focus on this moment of, in terms of their anti-caste work. Like, we all love Dil Chata Hai, like, of course, because that was their life and they
Yeah.
were just able to predict that. But when they're wading into territories that's not their life, 1 day
Yeah.
crash course is not going to cut it. You
Yeah.
really need to invest yourself and hire, like Gili Pucci, for example. They had Dalit
Right.
researchers. They had
Yeah.
Dalit people
Yeah.
on set. They were not shy, and that was also Neeraj Ghevan. That was Netflix. The production of that show, Ajib Dastan, was created by Karan Johar Production.
Mm.
Yeah.
They credited, and they didn't have to. I mean, there was, no obvious parallels there, but Konkana Sen Sharma accepted 2 awards and then talked about coming out as Dalit. Neeraj Kevin talked about coming out as Dalit. So one would imagine that that same practice would follow in Made in Heaven, but it didn't. Like, look at the remarkable differences between then and now.
You're right.
And that was just
I
a
have to,
year later.
yeah, I think like a thing, like, one of the things that was interesting as this was unfolding is, I happen to know a lot of, I happen to have a very close friend who works in entertainment law in the US. And when I was telling her, and she also loved the episode, and then the controversy broke, and she says she's so fed up because she works with folks in the US, and then she works with folks in India, and she's like, it's just like the absolute Wild West. Like, they will not engage legally with copyright issues, with different types of credits, like inspired by or thanks to or created by, whatever. All
But
that
why
stuff.
not? But what's at stake here? But why not?
Because think about it, like when I was growing up, I know that we were 100% part of a copycat culture. Think about Anu Malik songs, Bappi Lahiri songs, all these songs that you heard in pop songs, and that they would be the Hindi version. Entire movies made from Hollywood movies and remade in Bollywood. So it's just been how they do stuff. They just take whatever, but it's not possible anymore, as you were
Right.
saying, because we are on these various streaming platforms. They go everywhere. Everybody can access anything. We are also hyper connected. So something has to like intensely shift. And like, it always brings me back to this question, and we're sort of running out of time, but I really want to get this question out, which is like, there is like the politics, the legality, all
Yeah.
of that stuff that needs to, of course, change. But I can never decide whether the culture has to change first, whether horrible controversies like what's happening to you right now have to happen before we grow up and accept that the laws have to engage, or does the culture have to change? Like, for example, in the US, and we all live in the US, as you know, caste discrimination is going to be going on the books now.
Yeah.
Legally, there are these states trying to pass it. Great victories for Shama Sawant and all these folks in Seattle. Interesting stuff. So culture has to change first, or the law? What's slower? What needs to? I know they need to move in tandem, but
Right.
what do you feel with all this going on?
I think I'm going to echo what is a very strong sentiment within the anti caste community in the
Mhm.
United States. The strong sentiment here is that we can't wait for the culture to change because people will never feel charitable towards including Dalit people, Adivasi people, lower caste people. We have to make the law
Yeah.
so stringent and powerful that they have to do it. Like, why has caste traveled from India to everywhere in the world? That's
Mhm.
because there was no accountability. It's suddenly people who are have very racist and sexist ideas in India go outside and are forced to change their ideology. They are forced to respect Black people, whether they do it inside or not. They're forced to respect the authority of women who are in charge, whether
Mhm.
they want to or not, because that's the culture there. Unless we have the power to create that culture, which we don't, because as Dalits, we are marginalized communities. The dominant caste culture is the dominant culture. So when that's not happening, then the law needs to step in. I don't think we can wait for the culture to catch up, and who knows how long that will take. But once a law is there, and there is an immigrant population that understands that if we discriminate against our Dalit Adivasi colleagues, or and they're not just Dalits from India, Dalits from Nepal, Dalits from
Yeah.
Pakistan, Dalits from Bangladesh, if and Sri Lanka, etc. If we do that, then we will be held accountable. And we have to create a culture of accountability. And unfortunately, whether we like it or not, that comes from legality. And
Mhm.
like the culture is so resistant in the US. Like right now, when we are talking about caste, their responses to say caste doesn't exist, while violently also being casteist in the way they're talking about it. So they're
Absolutely.
doing the same, they're doing the two things. They're saying, whether they are talking through religious ideas or just what the way Indian culture is, they'll justify caste while also saying caste doesn't exist. So in a
Mhm.
situation like that, the best defense for folks is to have laws. For example, people will never accept trans or LGBTQ people of a certain part of the population will never say, yes, we recognize their humanity. But if there are laws, then they will be forced to accept the humanity that personal
Great.
feelings don't matter. And
Yeah.
then we create protections against whether it's trans or LGBTQ people, or whether it's Dalit or marginalized people, whether it's Native people, Black people. That's why, like, the civil rights law, the movement was so important, because it didn't wait for the culture for white people to magnanimously accept Black people
Right.
as equals.
To
It
slowly come
forced them to
around.
do it through law. So I feel that legality comes first, and then it creates opportunity for the culture to catch up, at
Yeah,
least in this case.
I accept that. Thank you so much, Yashica.
I
Thank
know
you
we're
so
running
much.
out of time, but thank you so much for your presence in this
That's
episode.
very inspiring, wonderful, such important stuff. Thank you for joining us.
I
Thank you.
appreciate being here. Thank you.
We'll be back on The Wire next week with another question, another exciting guest, and more conversation.